Hello everyone, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to introduce you all to the text tool inside of GIMP. So whenever you want to add a title or any generic text to your image documents inside of GIMP, you would use the text tool for that, of course. So you'll find the text tool over on the top left hand side by default inside of the toolbox. It's the one that is shaped like the letter A. You can now hover over any part of your document, and when you left click, you're going to be creating a region for text to be written onto. So initially you're going to see four corners. You can use these four corners to stretch the box, the bounds of your text. It doesn't really make much sense to adjust those yet because we haven't actually typed anything. So as you'll see in this little pop-up window, we have the font that we're going to be writing with, the size of the text measured in pixels by default, though you can change that to a different measurement if you prefer. The color selector in the bottom right hand corner, and then the option to make it bold, italic, underline, and strike through as extra text options. Now the defaults for the text that you just created are being pulled from the tool options over on the left hand side. So under all of these tools, you have options that can be assigned to any tool in GIMP. And for the text tool, whatever these are set to is going to be the defaults that you write with on your titles. So for instance, if you want to change the font for any text area you're going to write in your document, then the place you should actually change it is over on this left-hand side in the tool options. So you could click on this drop-down menu and change it to any font that you have installed on your computer. If you need additional fonts, you can go to sites like dafont.com and find fonts that you can also use in your project. Just keep an eye on the licensing agreements as you do that. Some are completely free to use, while others are not. So with all of that said, let's go back to actually adding the text onto the screen. So once again, click on the area that you want to type the text onto using the text tool. And now you can start typing whatever you need it to say. So I'll say something like text tutorial here. By default, this is all going to write on one line. So if you type a lot of information, like let's just add stuff that just goes on and on and on, you'll see that it doesn't actually jump down to the next line automatically. So if you want multiple lines in one single text element, then you can find the section of the text that you want to jump down to the next line and hit enter in order to make that happen. So now we have two lines because there's an enter creating the break. Now note here, I actually left one blank space. There is an empty space here. And in some cases, especially with centering text, that little blank space can actually affect how your text is going to show. So if I delete that right now, you can see that the text to the left actually shifts over a little bit to the right in order to recenter it. So extra blank spaces are going to matter when you're creating titles. Be careful about that. Make sure you don't have any extra coming before your text and none that are coming after, and possibly in between as well if you create new lines like I just did. Okay, so for right now, I'm going to go ahead and delete this extra text. You can see that it keeps readjusting the bounds automatically. If you want to manually set bounds or just create a bigger space for the text to show in, then that's when you can pull on these corners to drag the text in any direction you want. So if you pull on one side, like over here, then it's just going to be pulling the text box over to the left. Then you can adjust both horizontal and vertical directions at the same time. And then depending on which corner you grab, it's going to be stretching from the corner that you select, of course. So if we want to take this text and center it a little bit more vertically, I could just hit enter to add an extra line. So centering your text inside of this text box is pretty simple. You can see on the tool options over here, we have justify. By default, that's centered. You can also make it right justified to put it to the right and left justified if you need it left aligned. For centering your text vertically, one good way to do that is to use guides. So let's exit out of this box right now. And then let's go up to the image menu. So down here at the bottom, you'll find guides. So these guides are little dotted lines that will show while you're editing the document, but they don't actually show up when you export. They're only meant to help you organize your document and get things lined up properly. So if I go up to the image menu and I go down to guides, we can do new guide by percent, which is usually what I would do. Because if you do it by percentages and you need it to be 50% across, then you don't have to guess the number of pixels. You don't need to know the width of your document or the height of your document. You just need to know, roughly speaking, how far across it should be. So if we want to center text vertically, then we're going to want a horizontal guide. So that means it's going to go left to right. You can also center things horizontally by using a vertical guide. Let's create a horizontal guide right at the middle. So now we can take our text element using the move tool on this text layer, left click and drag it down. And then it's going to automatically snap to this guideline. Now our text isn't going to be perfectly centered on this line right now. Since we manually stretched the bounds of the text box, we would need to actually readjust it in order to get this text to recenter. So if I pull on this corner, we can bring the text box up to right about here. And now when we move this layer, it's going to be centering this dotted line rather than what you see in the box. So it'll be much easier to get it to center properly here. So if we want the text to be perfectly centered both horizontally and vertically, we can also add in a vertical guide. So I'll go to new guides by percent, click on the drop down, do a vertical guide 50% across horizontally. And now we can snap both of these guides at the same time. With that little crosshair, all we just need to do is use the move tool and snap it into position. So likewise, if we want the text to be centered but a little bit higher on the screen, we could just pull this guide up or create a new guide, get it to be roughly where we want it to be, and then get this box to match up in the crosshairs right there, and we have our text nicely centered on the screen. So I did mention earlier that if you want to change how all of your text is going to look as you create new text elements, then you can do that over here in the text options. But if you use the text tool and you click on a box, either a new one or existing, then you can also change the settings for the text up here. However, one thing you've really got to keep in mind is that you have to select the text you want to edit. So if I left click on my mouse, I hold the left click down and I drag over here to the right in order to select all of the text characters inside of this text box. You'll know because they are all outlined individually by this kind of golden yellow box. Then with this selection, I can change anything about them by editing up here. So I can change the font size very easily by changing it to 250 here. And you'll see that the text gets bigger, and we actually need to expand this box a little bit. So one of the downsides of manually setting the bounds of your box is that you may have to adjust it manually later as well. It may not automatically respond to the changes you make, but it's not too hard to just pull that down like so. You can also select all your text and change the font. Unfortunately, here you have to type it. There's no drop-down menu, so if you need to find the name of a font you want to change to, you can click over here in the tool options for the font and get the name of any of the fonts that are installed on your computer. Then just type that name into here. So for instance, I'll just type in MS Serif just to demonstrate. So MS Serif, and as you can see when you start typing, if it detects that that font's installed, then you'll get a drop down here. But not before you actually start typing the name in. So we have our text there. Different fonts are going to take up different amounts of space, of course, so I might need to drop this back down to 200 if I want it to fit inside of this small area. So I'm not a fan of that one. I'm going to type in and just change this back to Babysnoy as a nice title font for right now. So I'll also adjust the dimensions of the box one more time, roughly equal spacing here on top and bottom with relation to the text. So now with the move tool, we can snap it back into place. And if we need to adjust the guide, we can do that and just snap the box to the guide once again and just have it positioned wherever we want. So there's many other tools you have for editing your text inside of GIMP. Let's show two off right now. One is how to stroke your text to give it a outline. For instance, a black outline to this white text, make it stand out a little bit more. And then there's also drop shadow, which is similar. It basically creates a background shadow copy of the text characters that can be positioned usually a little bit down and to the right, but it can be any direction. And it'll sit in the background with optional blurriness, and you can also have it have optional partial opacity. If you have less than 100% opacity, that means that it's going to be partially transparent. So 100% opacity means that something is not transparent at all. If you put 50% opacity, it means it's half transparent, half see-through, and so on and so forth. So to give your text a stroke outline, first you want to choose the color that you're going to stroke the text with in the top left. So with this active foreground color selector, I'm going to click on that and I'll just choose a black color. Either you can select it manually, whatever color you want here, or you can choose from some of the defaults down here. So I'll hit OK. So now in order to add a black stroke to the text, we need to get the selection from our text. So we're not actually adding it directly here, but rather we need to do alpha to selection on the text layer. So in the bottom right hand corner, you'll see the layers window by default. We can right click on our text tutorial layer and then go down to alpha to selection at the bottom. So when we choose that, you'll see a dotted outline of each of our text characters, and this is what we'll use as the selection to add the stroke to. So now that we have this selection, we can right click, do edit, and then do stroke selection. So with this little pop-up, we can choose solid color. You can also stroke with a pattern. GIMP has some patterns that you can find in the top right over here that you can use as an alternative to a solid color. Usually, I would just go with a solid color though. So line width here is how thick you want the stroke line on each of these characters to be. Because the text isn't that big, I would probably drop it down to something more like 6, which I think is roughly the default. And so we can go ahead and hit stroke here. So that's going to give us a black outline all around this text. And one thing to note though is that because we were working on the text layer, that it actually took the text and made it temporarily uneditable. So if you make a change that converts a text layer to an image layer like this, you can go back either by hitting Control Z a few times, or in the future, you may still be able to use the text tool and then left click on the area with the text. And as long as GIMP still remembers with the GIMP document that this was text, you can hit edit, and that's going to pull it back to the state where it was still text. So you can see in this case, it removes the stroke because the stroke made it not editable as text. And so we can revert back to this state. So what you might want to do instead is with this selection, you can create a new layer in the bottom right. So I'll go down here and I'll create a new layer and add it to the image. So I'll just call this stroke layer, hit enter. Now we'll just do the same step. So we still have the selection from the text layer, but now we're working on the stroke layer. I'm going to right click, go down to edit, do stroke selection, and let's use the same settings here, 6 pixels, solid color, stroke. And now this is on a different layer. So I can pull this stroke behind the text tutorial layer, and that's going to be an ordering thing. So whatever is on top on this layers list is going to be whatever shows first whoever's looking at the image really. So it'll be up to you if you want the stroke or any other effects to eat into the original white color of the text, or if you want it to strictly sit behind the text. But now that they are separate layers here, if you use the move tool on one of the layers, let's just drag this around, you'll see that the stroke doesn't follow the text. So this is one of the downsides of not having them combined on one layer. But there's an easy fix called layer groups. In the bottom right hand corner, right next to the create layer button, you can create a new layer group. So we'll go ahead and do that. I can just call this text layer group by double clicking on the name of the layer group and changing it, typing in a new name. So let's drag both of these layers into the layer group. Just drag and drop, left click, hold, drag, drop, and reorder them inside of this group wherever you want. So now if we left click on the layer group itself, you'll see with the move tool on the left hand side in the tool options that you can hold shift in order to move the active layer rather than pick a layer or a guide basically. But by default, when you left click on your screen, it's going to move the first layer it clicks on from top to bottom ordering in the layers window. But if you choose move the active layer, then whatever layer or layer group you have selected over in the bottom right is going to be the one that gets moved, which in this case, we want to make sure we're moving the group, not the individual layers in between. So with this setup, either clicking move the active layer or holding shift to toggle it between these two options, we can left click and drag this entire layer group as one thing. So this is how we can easily edit an entire text setup all as one unit. So that's really handy to know. We can see though that the selection for this layer group is way bigger than the text itself though. So I'm going to hit Control Z, and you can click on each individual layer to see the bounds. So these dotted line bounds are going to determine things like being able to snap and center your layers. And we can see that the stroke layer here is actually sized to the entire screen. And I'll hide the text tutorial text to show that it's not close to the bounds of the stroke itself. So we can fix that and make this bounds match the inner stroke area by going up to the layer menu and choosing crop to content. Make sure that your stroke layer is selected in the right side. So crop to content. And now the bounds of this layer actually match what's inside of it, which by extension is going to help us size the layer group, since the layer group is just a combination of all the underlying layers. So now the layer group has this box here, and we can drag it around the screen all as one unit and have it snap to things like our guides much easier. So the last thing I want to add for this video is adding drop shadow to your text. And I'm actually going to add it directly onto the text layer here. Since after you add drop shadow, if you do want to edit your text, you can still do that with the text tool. And it's not really too much of a drawback, because if you're going to edit your text again, most likely you're also going to want to edit the drop shadow so that the shadow reflects whatever changes you make to the text. Maybe you change the characters or the words inside of it, or just the font or the size. Either way, you're going to want new drop shadow. So with the text tutorial layer selected, I'm going to go up to the filters menu, come down to light and shadow, and drop shadow. And when we have this tool selected, you should see a little preview of what the shadow is going to look like. If I hold Control and then scroll middle mouse wheel, I can zoom in on it a little bit. We can toggle preview on and off, and you can see how it's going to look. So with the default settings, there's going to be a blur, and there's also going to be 50% transparency. So it's going to be a little bit more subtle than I usually like. So if you want the drop shadow to look more like the text, you can drop down the blur radius. The closer you get to 0, the more obvious the original shape is going to be. At 0 blur radius, it's just the original shape of the characters, offset, and then changed to a black color by default. If you make the opacity 1.0, then that's going to make it not transparent at all. You won't be able to see the background behind it. So then at this point, it becomes a very, very strong shadow, which can be a stylistic choice that you might prefer. Also, you'll see XY up here. If you want to move the shadow closer to the text, then just drop down the XY values. By default, these are locked together, so you can unlock them on the right if for some reason you want the Y position to be a different offset value than the X position. So I can kind of set it up like that. With this glow radius, you can take the original shape of the shadow and kind of have it bulge out a little bit. So if I grow a few pixels here with circles, you'll see it kind of becomes a little bit more circular, round, and just kind of blots out from its original size. You can also change this to square, which is going to make it grow with a square shape. Might be more appropriate here. And diamond as well as another option. So with that, you can make the drop shadow bigger than the original text, if that's something you're looking. So with these grow settings, you can make the shadow bigger than the text was originally if you want. And when you're done, you can go ahead and commit everything with the OK button here. And also, if you want to take your current settings and reuse them later, you can click this plus button here, save it as a preset, and then anytime you come into this tool in future projects, you can just click on the drop down for presets, and it'll be here at the bottom, so you can just load up your defaults. So you can just load up your settings really, really fast, so that can be handy. So let's go ahead and hit OK here and zoom out, Control down on the middle mouse wheel, and we can see we have a nice drop shadow. Toggling the stroke on and off, we can see how we can combine these effects. I guess for a while I've had the stroke on, but hopefully you can see how with the stroke off, then the tops become just plain white, but with the strokes on, then we have some kind of border all the way around our text. So we've covered quite a bit about the basics of using text tools and creating titles and text inside of GIMP and some of the effects you can add on top of that. I hope you found it helpful, and if you need to learn more about creating text graphics in GIMP, I do have some other tutorials on my channel that cover more specific topics. But for this video, I've been Chris. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my future video content.